dog refuses to leave owner's grave. But when a stranger follows him, the truth is heartbreaking. The cemetery was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the cold evening breeze. The sky was painted in muted shades of orange and grey, the last remnants of daylight fading beyond the hills. Michael adjusted his coat against the chill as he made his way down the stone pathway, his boots crunching over the gravel. He had been coming here every week for months now, ever since his mother had passed. It was a ritual he followed, a way to feel close to her, even if it was only in silence. But today, something was different. Near the edge of the graveyard, nestled between two tall oak trees, a dog lay curled up on a tombstone, its body tense despite the cold. The animal was thin, its golden fur matted and dirty, and yet it showed no signs of leaving. It sat there, its gaze fixed on the stone beneath it, as if it were standing guard. Michael slowed his steps, his curiosity piqued. The sight struck a chord in him. There was something haunting about the dog's stillness, something that went beyond simple loyalty. Other mourners passed by, glancing at the animal with curiosity, but no one approached. They whispered amongst themselves, shaking their heads before moving on. Michael lingered, observing the way the dog's ears perked at every approaching sound, its body tense with silent vigilance. Whatever had brought it here, it wasn't just instinct. He glanced down at the name etched into the tombstone. Thomas Whitaker, beloved son and friend. Michael frowned. The name felt familiar, though he couldn't place why. He searched his memory, but nothing came to mind. The dog shifted slightly, sniffing the air before lowering its head onto its paws. Michael crouched down a few feet away. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice low and calm. The dog's ears flicked, but it didn't move. A few feet away, an old woman dressed in a thick grey coat paused near the path, watching the scene unfold. "That dog's been there for weeks," she said, her voice laced with sympathy. "Ever since the funeral." Michael looked up at her. "Whose dog is it?" The woman sighed, shaking her head. "No one knows. It just showed up the day Thomas was buried and hasn't left since. People tried to take it in, but it always finds its way back here." She tucked her hands into her coat pockets. "It's heartbreaking, really." Michael turned back to the dog, whose eyes remained fixed on the tombstone. Something about the unwavering dedication in its posture sent a chill down his spine. A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, sending a few dry leaves skittering across the ground. The dog lifted its head slightly but didn't move otherwise. Michael took a careful step forward. "Are you waiting for him?" he asked softly, not expecting an answer. The dog's gaze flickered toward him for the first time. Its deep brown eyes held something, not fear but recognition. Michael exhaled slowly. "You knew him, didn't you?" The dog didn't move, didn't blink. A strange sense of unease settled in Michael's stomach. He had always believed dogs could sense things beyond human perception. Grief, danger, even the lingering presence of those who had passed. Something about the way this dog sat, its unwavering devotion, its unwillingness to leave. It felt like it was guarding something. The woman let out another sigh. "It's best to let it be," she said. "Some bonds go beyond death." Michael nodded absently, his mind still turning over the questions in his head. The woman walked away, and soon the cemetery returned to its usual quiet. But Michael stayed, watching the dog. After a few minutes, he stood and adjusted his coat, preparing to leave. The sun had dipped further, casting long shadows across the gravestones. But as he turned, he heard a low whimper. He paused. The dog was looking straight at him now, its head slightly tilted. Michael hesitated before taking another step back toward it. "Are you okay, buddy?" The dog let out a small whine, then, slowly, deliberately, stood up. It took a step away from the grave, then another. Michael frowned as the dog turned slightly, looking at him, then walking forward again, as if waiting for him to follow. A chill ran down his spine. Something about this wasn't just instinct. This dog was trying to lead him somewhere, and for reasons he couldn't explain, Michael found himself taking the first step forward, following it into the growing darkness. The wind howled through the cemetery, rustling the dry leaves that had gathered along the narrow stone path. Michael hesitated for a moment, watching the dog as it padded forward, pausing only to glance back at him. It wasn't a casual movement. It was deliberate, a silent invitation. Michael exhaled, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his coat. "All right, buddy," he muttered. "Let's see where you're taking me." The dog, Buddy as Michael decided to call him, moved with purpose, though his body still carried the frailty of exhaustion. His ribs were visible beneath his matted fur, and his gait was slow but steady. Michael followed. They weaved between rows of tombstones, the sky darkening with each passing moment. The farther they went, the quieter the cemetery became, as if the world outside had faded away. Buddy suddenly stopped near an older section of the graveyard, where the stones were cracked and worn by time. Michael's brows furrowed. Why here? Buddy stood still, his gaze locked on something beyond the graves. Michael followed his line of sight and saw a man standing near the cemetery gates. His posture was stiff, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. Though his face was shrouded in shadows, Michael could sense something off about him. Buddy let out a low, almost imperceptible growl. Michael stiffened. The man didn't move, didn't even acknowledge them, but there was something unsettling about his presence, like he was watching without watching. Buddy took a step back, his ears pinned against his head. Michael's instincts kicked in. Whoever this man was, Buddy didn't trust him, and that was enough for Michael to stay alert. He turned his attention back to the dog. "Come on," he whispered. "Let's go." Buddy hesitated, giving one last wary glance at the stranger before leading Michael further into the graveyard. The moment they moved, Michael felt it. That man was following them. They walked deeper into the cemetery, the sound of their footsteps barely audible over the wind. Michael's pulse quickened. He wasn't the paranoid type, but something about this entire situation felt wrong. Buddy suddenly stopped again, this time near an old oak tree that stood tall in the farthest corner of the cemetery. The tree was massive, its twisted roots snaking out from the ground like skeletal fingers. At its base, the earth looked disturbed. Michael frowned. "What is this?" Buddy whined, then began to dig. Michael's heart pounded as he crouched beside the dog. "You're really trying to show me something, aren't you?" He hesitated for only a second before using his hands to clear away the loose dirt. What he found sent a chill through his entire body. It was a small leather pouch, tied shut with twine. Michael swallowed hard. His fingers trembled as he untied the knot and pulled the pouch open. Inside, there was a folded letter, its edges yellowed with age. He unfolded it carefully, eyes scanning the faded ink, and with every word his breath grew heavier. "If you're reading this, something has happened to me. I was right all along. I knew they would come for me. The truth is buried deeper than you think. But my best friend, he knows." Michael's blood ran cold. Best friend, Buddy. His gaze snapped back to the dog, who was staring at him expectantly. Michael's stomach tightened. Thomas Whitaker had left behind a message, a warning, and Buddy was the key to understanding it. The cemetery felt too quiet now, like the world was holding its breath. Michael swallowed hard and shoved the letter into his coat pocket. He needed to find out what this meant. But first, he needed to get out of here. He turned back toward the path and froze. The man from before was gone, but the heavy feeling in Michael's chest told him something. He hadn't left. He was still watching, waiting, and now, Michael was sure of one thing. This wasn't just about a grieving dog. This was about a secret someone didn't want him to uncover. And whoever that someone was, they weren't going to let him walk away easily. The cold wind howled through the trees as Michael hurried down the cemetery path, Buddy trotting close beside him. His heart still pounded from the eerie encounter with the man near the gates. Who was he? And why had he vanished the moment Michael found the letter? The message from Thomas Whitaker replayed in his mind. "The truth is buried deeper than you think. But my best friend, he knows." Michael glanced down at Buddy. The dog had led him here for a reason. He wasn't just mourning, he was trying to show something. And now, Michael needed to find out what. They reached the main road where Michael's car was parked just beyond the cemetery gates. The small town surrounding it had already settled into the quiet of night, the streets empty except for the occasional flickering street lamp. Michael opened the passenger side door. "Come on, Buddy." The golden retriever hesitated for a moment, then jumped into the seat. Michael got in, shutting the door quickly and locking it. His fingers gripped the steering wheel as he took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Who do I even go to with this? The police? He didn't even know what he had yet. Just a letter, a nervous dog, and a gut feeling that something was very, very wrong. Michael pulled the letter from his pocket and read it again under the dim glow of the streetlight. "The truth is buried deeper than you think." His gaze drifted down to the cemetery in the rearview mirror. Buried, his grip tightened on the wheel. What if Thomas hadn't meant it metaphorically? Buddy let out a soft whimper and nudged his arm. Michael looked down at him, then back at the letter. If Buddy had led him to the first clue, then maybe. Michael's stomach twisted. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see where else you take me." He put the car into drive and pulled onto the empty road, following Buddy's silent directions. For nearly 10 minutes, Buddy sat quietly in the passenger seat, his eyes alert as the car moved through winding roads. Then, as they approached the outskirts of town, Buddy suddenly perked up. Michael noticed his ears twitch, his posture shifting forward. "You recognize this place?" Michael asked. Buddy let out a low whine. Michael slowed the car, scanning the area. The road was narrower here, flanked by thick trees. No houses, no streetlights. Then in the distance, a dark silhouette emerged. A cabin, half hidden by overgrown brush and towering pines. Buddy let out a sharp bark. Michael's stomach dropped. This was where Buddy wanted to go. The cabin looked abandoned. Its wooden walls were worn with age, the roof slightly caved in at one corner. The windows were cracked and clouded with dust, and the front porch sagged under its own weight. Michael parked a short distance away and killed the engine. He took a deep breath, then turned to Buddy. This was his place, wasn't it? Buddy stared at the cabin, his body rigid. Michael's instincts screamed danger, but something inside him knew he couldn't leave now. This place held answers. He opened the door, stepping onto the damp ground. Buddy followed without hesitation. The night was eerily still, the only sound being the occasional rustling of tree branches. Michael approached the door, reaching for the handle. Buddy suddenly growled. Michael froze. The dog's fur bristled, his body tense as he stared toward the side of the cabin. Michael followed his gaze. Something was there. He squinted through the darkness, heart hammering. Then he saw it. Footprints, fresh ones. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they still were. Michael swallowed hard, his pulse racing. Who else knew about this place? He took a cautious step forward, his breath visible in the cold night air. The cabin door was unlocked. Michael hesitated, then slowly pushed it open. The hinges groaned loudly, echoing through the empty space. Buddy stayed close as they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the scent of rotting wood clinging to everything. Michael swept his flashlight across the room. A small table, a rusted lantern, old faded papers scattered across the floor. Then his light landed on a photo nailed to the wall. Michael stepped closer, his breath catching. It was a picture of Thomas Whitaker, and standing next to him, a man whose face had been scratched out. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. Who was he? Why had someone wanted him erased? Buddy whined beside him, his tail tucked low. Michael turned, scanning the rest of the cabin. Then he saw something that made his blood freeze. On the floor near the fireplace sat a pile of freshly dug-up dirt, and sticking out from the soil, the corner of another leather pouch. Michael's throat went dry. Buddy padded forward, sniffing the disturbed earth. Michael hesitated only for a moment before kneeling down and pulling the pouch from the dirt. He untied the string, his hands shaking slightly. Inside was a key, a heavy iron key, old, but still intact. Michael exhaled slowly, another piece of the puzzle. He turned the key over in his palm, glancing around the cabin. Was there a hidden compartment here? A safe? A locked box? Before he could investigate further, Buddy's growl cut through the silence. Michael snapped his head up. Footsteps. Outside. Someone was here, watching. Michael's heart slammed against his ribs. He extinguished the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. Buddy pressed close to his leg, ears pinned back. Michael listened. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the doorknob turned. The cabin was silent, the air thick with tension. Buddy pressed against his leg, his growl deep and steady, a low, guttural warning. Michael's mind raced. Whoever was outside wasn't here by accident. The knob twisted again, this time with more force. Michael clenched his fists, glancing around the room for something, anything he could use as a weapon. The cabin was mostly empty, but near the fireplace an old iron poker leaned against the brick. He grabbed it just as the door creaked open. The faint glow of moonlight spilled into the cabin, illuminating a tall figure standing in the doorway. Michael held his breath. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, the figure stepped inside. Buddy snarled, baring his teeth. The man stopped. His face remained in the shadows, but his posture was calm. Too calm. Michael tightened his grip on the iron poker. "Who the hell are you?" A beat of silence. Then the man's voice came, low and deliberate. "I could ask you the same thing." His tone sent a chill down Michael's spine. The man took another step forward, and the light from the broken window finally revealed part of his face. A sharp jawline, eyes dark as coal. His hair was slicked back, his coat expensive, tailored. Michael knew that look. Money, power, control. Buddy growled again, his stance firm. The man's gaze flickered to the dog, then back to Michael. "I see you found Whitaker's little pet," he said, voice smooth but laced with something dangerous. Michael's chest tightened. "You knew Thomas?" The man let out a slow breath, almost like a sigh. "Everyone in this town knew Thomas." Michael didn't believe that for a second. "You've been following me," Michael said, watching for the man's reaction. A small smirk tugged at the corner of the stranger's mouth. "That depends. Have you been somewhere you shouldn't be?" Michael's grip on the poker tightened. "Why are you here?" he asked, voice firm. The man took another slow step forward, as if testing Michael's patience. "Thomas had a habit of keeping things that didn't belong to him," he said. "I'm here to collect what's mine." Michael's stomach turned. His mind flashed to the key he had found buried under the fireplace. He didn't know what it opened, but now he was certain this man did. Buddy let out a sharp bark, stepping between them. The man tilted his head, his smirk vanishing. "That's enough." Michael narrowed his eyes. This guy thought he was in control. Time to prove him wrong. Without warning, Michael swung the iron poker, fast, aiming for the man's ribs. But the man was quicker. He stepped back just in time, the poker slicing through empty air. Michael barely had a second to react before the man lunged forward, grabbing his wrist in a vice grip. "Bad move," he muttered. Michael gritted his teeth, struggling against the man's strength. His grip was like steel, but Michael had something he didn't. Buddy. The dog snapped. A blur of golden fur lunged forward, jaws clamping down onto the man's arm. He let out a sharp curse, stumbling backward. "Get this damn dog off me." Michael didn't hesitate. He wrenched his arm free, grabbed Buddy's collar, and ran. They bolted out the cabin's back door, disappearing into the trees. The cold night air burned in Michael's lungs as he pushed forward, his legs aching with every step. Buddy ran beside him, his body tense, ears alert. Behind them, the cabin door slammed open. Michael didn't look back. Whoever that man was, he wasn't done. The trees blurred around them as they sprinted deeper into the woods. The ground was uneven, roots and fallen branches threatening to trip them with every step. Michael's mind raced. He needed a plan. He had a key, but no idea what it unlocked. He had a letter, but no proof of what it meant. And now he had a target on his back. They reached the edge of the forest where Michael had parked his car. He yanked the door open, and Buddy leaped inside without hesitation. Michael jumped into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he shoved the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Without wasting a second, he slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement as they sped away from the cabin. Michael gripped the wheel, his pulse pounding in his ears. He glanced at Buddy, who sat in the passenger seat, still tense, still alert. "You saved my ass back there," Michael muttered. Buddy let out a low huff, his tail thumping once against the seat. Michael exhaled, trying to steady his breath. He needed answers, and there was only one place left to look: the town records. If Thomas had been hiding something, his past would tell the story. Michael pressed harder on the gas, his mind set. He wasn't running anymore. Now he was hunting. The town was eerily quiet at this hour. Streetlights cast long shadows over the empty sidewalks as Michael pulled into a parking space near the county records building. The engine hummed for a moment before he cut it off, leaving only the sound of the wind rattling through the trees. Buddy sat in the passenger seat, his ears still alert, his body tense. Even after the chase through the woods, the dog hadn't relaxed. Not completely. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. That man back at the cabin, who was he? And more importantly, what the hell had Thomas Whitaker been caught up in? Michael reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the key he had found buried under the fireplace. He turned it over in his palm, its heavy weight pressing against his skin. What did it unlock? He was about to find out. The county records office was a relic from another era, a squat brick building that smelled of dust and faded ink. Michael stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The clerk at the front desk, a woman in her late 50s with thin-rimmed glasses, looked up, mildly surprised to see anyone at this hour. "Help you with something?" she asked. Michael slid the key back into his pocket and forced a polite smile. "I'm looking for property records on a Thomas Whitaker." The woman frowned. "You a relative?" Michael hesitated. "Something like that," she sighed, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Records that old aren't digitized. You'll have to check the archives." She gestured toward the far side of the room. "Third row, bottom drawer." Michael nodded his thanks and made his way toward the metal filing cabinets. Buddy followed closely, his paws barely making a sound on the linoleum floor. The archive section was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old paper. Michael crouched down, his fingers tracing the metal labels until he found Whitaker, Thomas, deceased. He pulled the drawer open, revealing a thick manila folder. Inside, Thomas's life unfolded in documents, property deeds, legal notices, a few old photographs. Michael flipped through the pages, scanning them quickly. Then, something caught his eye. A safety deposit box receipt. Issued 22 years ago. Michael's pulse quickened. The deposit box belonged to Whitaker National Bank, a small local bank that had existed for decades. And the best part? The box number matched the tag on the key in Michael's pocket. Buddy let out a small huff, as if sensing the shift in Michael's energy. Michael exhaled, gripping the key tightly. So that was it. Whatever Thomas had hidden, whatever people were willing to kill to keep secret, it was in that box. Michael wasted no time. The bank wasn't far, just a few blocks away. But as he approached, his stomach tightened. Something felt wrong. The bank was dark, its glass doors locked for the night. But the uneasy feeling crawling up Michael's spine had nothing to do with the building itself. It was the car parked across the street. Black, tinted windows, engine still running. Michael slowed his steps. The man from the cabin, he was waiting. Michael clenched his jaw. No turning back now. He glanced at Buddy. "Stay close." The dog let out a quiet grunt in response. Michael crossed the street, heart pounding. Whatever was in that safety deposit box, someone else wanted it just as badly, and they weren't going to let him take it without a fight. Michael's breath was slow and controlled, but his pulse pounded against his ribs like a war drum. The black car hadn't moved. Its engine purred softly, the faint glow of a cigarette ember flickering behind the tinted glass. Someone was watching, waiting. Michael's grip tightened around the key in his pocket. Whatever was in that safety deposit box, it was worth following him for. He glanced down at Buddy. The dog stood tense beside him, ears pinned back, his body coiled like a spring. He sensed it too. Michael exhaled and forced himself forward. His shoes clicked against the pavement as he approached the bank's glass doors. They were locked as expected. A small sign on the side listed the 24-hour emergency access number, probably for high-priority clients with urgent transactions. Michael pulled out his phone and dialed. A groggy voice answered after 3 rings. "Whitaker National, this is Greg. It's after hours. What's the emergency?" Michael kept his voice steady. "I need access to my deposit box, number 417. A pause. Then a skeptical chuckle. "Bit late for that, don't you think? I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important." Silence. Then the sound of fingers tapping on a keyboard. "Deposit box 417. Last accessed 22 years ago," Greg murmured almost to himself. "Huh, that's strange." Michael's stomach twisted. "What's strange?" Before he could ask, Greg sighed. "All right, I can unlock the lobby remotely. You'll have 5 minutes." A sharp beep echoed through the quiet street as the bank doors clicked open. Michael stepped inside, Buddy following closely. The lobby was dark, lit only by the glow of the ATM screen and security monitors behind the counter. Michael moved fast, heading toward the row of safety deposit boxes in the back. Box 417 was at the bottom. He crouched, heart pounding, and slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly. The box creaked open. Inside, a single envelope. Michael grabbed it, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the brittle paper inside. His eyes skimmed the first few lines. Then his breath caught. It was a signed confession, a full-page letter, handwritten by Thomas Whitaker himself. "If you're reading this, then I didn't make it. I tried to stop him, I tried to warn people, but he owns too much and the town is afraid. If I disappear, know that it was Richard Coleman who had me silenced." Michael's stomach turned. Richard Coleman, the same man who had confronted him at the cabin, the same man who had been following him. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Thomas hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered, and Coleman had gotten away with it for 2 decades. Michael's mind raced. He had proof now. A real document, Whitaker's last words. But just as he folded the letter, the air shifted. A presence behind him. Michael barely had time to turn before a hand closed around his shoulder. He was yanked backward, slammed against the metal lockers. The impact sent a flash of pain down his spine. Buddy barked furiously, lunging forward, but a voice cut through the chaos. "Don't!" Michael blinked through the haze of pain, his vision locking onto the dark silhouette standing over him. Richard Coleman. The same cold, calculating expression, the same casual arrogance, but this time his patience was gone. "I told you to stop digging," Coleman murmured, "and yet here we are." Michael's breath was ragged. He forced himself to stay calm, stall, think. "So, you killed Whitaker," he said, voice steady, "and you've spent the last 20 years covering it up." Coleman's jaw twitched. "I did what was necessary." Buddy let out a deep, threatening growl. Coleman's eyes flicked toward the dog, lips curling in disgust. "This damn mutt!" Michael's fist clenched. Buddy had been there that night. He had witnessed it all. That's why he wouldn't leave the grave, Michael realized. He was waiting for someone to find the truth. Coleman exhaled, like he was tired of playing this game. "Give me the letter," he said, stepping forward. Michael shook his head. "No." Coleman's face darkened. His hand moved, reaching into his coat. Michael knew what was coming. A gun. Time slowed. Buddy's growl deepened. His muscles tensed. Michael acted on instinct. "Buddy, now!" The dog lunged, just as Coleman drew his weapon. Buddy's jaws clamped onto Coleman's wrist, twisting violently. Coleman let out a sharp cry, his grip loosening just enough. Michael slammed his fist into Coleman's gut, sending him staggering backward. The gun clattered to the floor. Buddy didn't hesitate. He knocked Coleman off balance, pinning him down with a deep, menacing snarl. Michael grabbed the gun and leveled it at Coleman's head. For the first time, the older man looked afraid. Michael's breath was unsteady. He had him. The man who had killed Thomas. The man who had tried to silence him. Michael's finger tightened on the trigger. Buddy didn't move, still standing over Coleman, his growl vibrating through the air. Michael swallowed hard. Then, sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through the lobby windows. Michael exhaled, his grip loosening slightly. It was over. The police swarmed the building within minutes. Coleman was arrested on the spot. The letter, Thomas's final testimony, was taken into evidence. Michael watched from the sidelines, Buddy sitting by his side, his tail flicking against the cold marble floor. A detective approached. "You did the right thing," the officer said. "If you had pulled that trigger, you'd be in cuffs too." Michael didn't respond. His mind was still catching up. The weight of everything, Whitaker's murder, Coleman's downfall, the years of corruption finally exposed, it was overwhelming. But one thing was certain. Thomas Whitaker had waited 2 decades for justice, and thanks to a loyal golden retriever, he had finally gotten it. Michael looked down at Buddy. The dog, sensing his gaze, turned and nudged Michael's arm. A quiet moment passed between them. Michael sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess that means you're stuck with me now." Buddy's tail thumped against the ground, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt like he wasn't alone anymore. Not really.